Good day to all. So for today's topic, we shall look into topic 7, governance in sustainable development strategies. There are 4 learning objectives for this subtopic. Number 1, to understand the environment and trade linkage. Number 2, to explore 3 perspectives on trade, environment and development. Number 3, to identify the MEA, or known as multilateral environmental agreements. And last but not least, to understand the physical and economic relationship in sustainable development strategies. So, environment and trade linkage, they are fundamentally related. This is because environmental damage is due to the increase of scale global economic activity. So as economic globalization proceeds and the global nature of many environmental problems become more evident. So at the most basic level, trade and environment are closely related because all economic activity is based on the environment. For example, like we have best natural resources from metals, minerals, soil, forests, and fisheries, included the energy that needed to process these natural resources. So people come to the trade environment debates from many different backgrounds. Therefore, from the different worldviews and also assumptions, there are different technical can be used, and it can be important obstacle to a meaningful dialogue and also towards the solutions. So people may understand the issues through any of these 3 perspectives of trade, environment, and also development. Therefore, we shall look into these 3 perspectives. So perspective number 1 is the trade. So trade creates the wealth that could be used to increase human well-being. National governments answer too directly to the national industries, and they will try to preserve the domestic market for this industry, at the same time keeping the foreign competitors at bay. So in doing so, government make their people worse off. For example, like domestic firms become more inefficient, domestic consumer required to pay higher prices, and more efficient foreign firms are being shut down. So the best protection is a strong system of rules against such behavior. Therefore, we have World Trade Organization (WTO) rules by which all the countries can abide. Even after signing WTO agreements, the countries will look for the loopholes. For example, like banning or restricting trade on environmental grounds may be one such loophole. So trade can actually be good for the environment since it creates wealth and it can be used for the environmental improvement. Second perspective is the environmental. So our current social and economic system include the reality of prices do not reflect the full cost of our environmental damage. So we all know that environmental damage, it is something that we couldn't pay the price. So in doing so, the government make the people worse off. For example, like our domestic firm make profit, but the public subsidize them by paying the cost of environmental degradation. So one way to avoid this problem is a strong system of rules spelling out clearly on how the environmental shall be protected at the national and also international level. Even after such rules are in place, the government and industry will look to scuttle them, which trade rules forbidding certain types of environmental regulations that may be required to do so. So more trade means more economic activity. Thus, in many cases, there are more environmental damages. So the wealth created by trade will not necessarily resulting in the environmental improvement. Moving on to the last perspective is the development. So over 1/5 of the world's population live in absolute poverty. So most of them in the developing countries, and the gap between the rich and poor countries continue to widening. So developing countries' top priority is reducing the poverty and narrowing the social gap. So openness to trade and investment may be a key way to do so in order for us to narrowing the social gap. Through the link between the openness and also economic growth are not automatic. So, however, rich countries protect their industries with subsidies, special trade rules, and tariff system that it can hurt the developing country like us as a producer and exporters. Therefore, the best solution is a strong set of multilateral rules against such behavior. However, current World Trade Organization rules are too deeply influenced by the powerful trading countries, or we call as powerful trading nations. And liberalization has in many instances selectively benefit the sectors of interest towards the developed country. So over time, such behavior is outlawed by trade rules, which rich countries will look for a new ways to keep their foreign competition out of their market by banning or restricting trade. So demanding that poor countries only comply with the rich country environmental standard is unreasonable if the demands are not accompanied by a technical or financial assistance. So for example, in many poor countries, clean water is a paramount. But in rich countries, it is no longer a primary concern, where the concerns are over global issues such as ozone depletion and climate change. Rich countries often cause most of the environmental damage in the first place. So moving on, we shall look into multilateral environmental agreements. So we shall understand first what does it mean by multilateral environmental agreements, and there are 7 MEAs that we will take a look one by one. So over the past 20 years, an extraordinary number of international environmental agreements have been concluded. So these are a few global treaties that open to any country. So very few MEAs actually regulate trade or contain trade-related provisions. Okay, as their measure do not substantially affect the trade flows or the value of the trade. So MEA yang pertama, number 1. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So the earliest of the key of MEA was drawn in 1973 and entered into the enforcement 2 years later. So it is to regulate the trade in certain species and their parts as well as the products made from such species. So this restriction range from a general prohibition on a commercial trade to a partial licensing system. So in recent years, it has become to address species traded in such volume as to have a significant economic value, such as certain tree and only fish species. Okay, so number 2, MEA number 2 is the Vienna Convention for Protection of the Stratosphere and the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the stratospheric ozone layer. So this convention was concluded in 1985, which time the ozone depletion was suspected but not yet confirmed. So a research has been provided and the cooperation to better understand the issue. They form a framework agreement under this convention. So the evidence soon become more stronger, and they drafted another protocol that established a regime of control for several classes of industrial chemical that can cause harm towards the stratospheric ozone layer. However, it has successfully implemented by using a precautionary approach, acting before the availability of clear scientific evidence of the stratospheric ozone. Okay, number 3, MEA's number 3 is the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste and their Disposal. So this convention resulted from the concerns of the developing countries, particularly in Africa, that they could become the dumping ground for the hazardous waste whose disposal in the developed world had become difficult and expensive. Kiranya negara-negara kaya ni, dia akan hantarkan dia punya waste disposal tu kepada Afrika. Jadinya convention ini ditubuhkan bagi membincangkan lah macam mana untuk menangani masalah ini. So the developing countries, particularly in Africa, and also the NGO have played a significant role in this convention. So discussion within the regime have been marked by dispute over the most appropriate strategy to control the movement of hazardous waste from the developed countries. So parties have adopted an amendment by banning the export of hazardous waste. Next, convention number 5 is the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. So open for signature at the Rio conference. So this convention objective is conserving the biological diversity, the sustainable use of these biological components, and the fair and equitable sharing of this benefit arising from the use of the genetic resources. Okay. So this Cartagena is a protocol which covering the trade most form of living genetically modified organism and the risk it may present to the biodiversity. So it can create a more advanced informed agreement system, and it will be introduced to the environment such as microorganism and seed and less complex system for monitoring for use as such as food, animal feed or processing. So bila kita kata bila kita sebut pasal biosafety ni kita kata generic material lah. Mungkin material tersebut ataupun sumber tersebut adalah daripada kilang makmal kan, campur, orang kata apa, ada genetik yang dicampur-campurkan. Sometimes this kind of species ataupun this kind of thing is not good or is not suitable for the environment. It can kill the ecosystem lah. So therefore, in this convention, they set out a procedure for countries to decide whether to restrict the imports of this living genetically modified organism. Okay, for example, there is a type of risk assessment that must be carried out before a country allowing the living genetically modified organism to be imported outside countries. Okay. Moving on, the next MEA is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol. So this convention is grappling with one of the most complex of environmental issues, which is climate change lah. So since such emission can rarely be limited with the technical, so the technology must be changed for the future production, consumption and also investment in favor of activity that emit fewer greenhouse gases. In December 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted and entering into force in the February 2005. So it created two categories of countries, those country with the greenhouse and those country without the greenhouse. Okay, so in fulfilling the Kyoto Protocol or Kyoto obligations, UNFCCC atau kita kata United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change will adopt the domestic policies and measure it with the significant trade implication.